who's a professor of international relations at Otago University. He joins us from Dunedin in New Zealand. A very warm welcome to you. So New Zealand has joined 22 other countries and the European Union in calling for Israel to allow for a full resumption of aid into Gaza immediately. My question to you, though, is why the delay in this level of joined-up thinking from the so-called Western world?
Well, I think partly because the reasons just gone through in the previous commentary, many European countries in particular felt after the Holocaust a sense of guilt, and they were reluctant to move against Israel. I think the other factor here is that many liberal democracies, particularly in Europe, were waiting to see. They basically were quite deferential to the United States when Biden was president, and they were waiting to see when Mr. Trump became president what was his position. I think there's a realization now that public pressure is such in many European countries, and not just European countries. You take a country like New Zealand, there's been widespread protests in many cities. And I think there's a sense that in liberal democracies, they can't ultimately be indifferent to public concern about the situation. So I think that's a factor. I think another factor is a perception amongst many countries that Mr. Trump himself is getting impatient with the Netanyahu government. And that's been indicated by the fact that the Trump administration negotiated directly with Hamas. Mr. Trump didn't visit Israel recently. So that may have emboldened those countries that have been sitting on the fence. But it's quite clear that Israel now finds itself under a lot of pressure from many liberal democracies.
Now, in the meantime, of course, we've seen the Global South take a much faster, much firmer stance on Israel. South Africa, of course, with its legal action at the International Court of Justice. Multiple Latin American countries cutting diplomatic ties with Israel, with the exception of perhaps Spain, Norway, maybe Ireland in Europe. Condemnation of Israel's actions in Gaza and, of course, accelerated settlement building in the West Bank has been a little vague and woolly at times. Why this global split, do you think?
I think that the Global South has been less affected by American leverage. Many liberal democracies, we've seen this with Ukraine, often needed the Washington to hold their hand when they were weighing up decisions whether to arm Ukraine. And we've seen in the Middle East that many liberal democracies have been very deferential towards Washington, knowing full well that Washington had a very close relationship with Israel and was not a disinterested observer. So I think the Global South position is partly because of the United States doesn't have the same leverage in the Global South. I think another factor here, though, Neave, is the fact that so many countries in the Global South have experienced colonialism in the past, have a sense of, they have a history of having to struggle for their own political self-determination. And given that experience, they can empathise with the Palestinians who've been denied the right of political self-determination. And I think that that's why they've been much more supportive of the Palestinians than many countries in the Western world.
Now, we know the UK, France and Canada are threatening sanctions on Israel. There is, of course, a difference between threatening punitive measures and actually taking them. Is there much real power in this move, do you think?
I think so. I think there is a recognition now that the situation has changed on the ground in a disastrous way. I mean, the New Zealand foreign minister described the situation last year in April as catastrophic. Given the fact we've just had a 3-month blockade on humanitarian aid, of course, it's much worse. And as your earlier commentary indicated, we are on the verge of many Palestinians on the verge of serious starvation. So I do think the situation has qualitatively changed. And I do think many Western governments are under pressure to do something. And there's also a recognition, I think another catalyst here for threatening sanctions is a recognition that the United States and Israel seem to be planning a joint initiative to distribute food and effectively disempower the UN. And I think that is not acceptable to many countries which want a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because the suspicion is that if the US and Israel jointly took over the distribution of humanitarian aid, then effectively the distribution of aid would be weaponized. And Mr. Trump has already indicated he actually envisaged the displacement of Palestinians from Gaza, a position which seems to coincide with some members of the Netanyahu government. So, in short, a trigger may have been the recognition that with the displacement of the UN as an impartial distributor of aid, the prospect of getting a two-state solution would virtually disappear. And that may be one of the reasons why the Europeans are coming forward.
Robert, we've seen in the wake of this new international pressure, as you mentioned, the limited restart of aid, the decision made by the Israeli Prime Minister's office, and contrary, of course, to the wishes of his right-wing allies in government, it does beg the question, how many more lives could have been saved if the international community had taken meaningful action sooner without feeling beholden to the United States, without the pressure of what might happen to the United Nations if aid is only being provided by Israel or through agencies operated by the United States?
Well, that's a great question. And the tragedy of this situation is that it's a failure beyond the United States and Israel and any other actors. It's a failure of the UN Security Council. The fact that we had a conflict raging for 15 months without the UN being able to fulfill its formal responsibility of ensuring global peace and security in an area like Gaza is a terrible failure. And I think there must be some soul searching when this conflict reaches a point where there's some sort of durable peace, because quite frankly, it's unacceptable in the 21st century where countries can exercise the veto and perpetuate a conflict for so long with such devastating humanitarian consequences. I understand from the Ministry of Health in Gaza, something like 53,000 Palestinians are now dead. And that's not in any way to minimize the terrible suffering that the Hamas's terrorist attack caused on Israel on the 7th of October 2023. I'm just saying, I think this is such a big problem. There needs to be a fundamental rethink about making the UN Security Council more functional, and that involves, I think, reviewing the use of the veto in the UN Security Council.
The UN is most certainly at a crossroads, it would seem. Israel, of course, in many ways being the catalyst in its actions in Gaza. Professor Robert Patman, good to have you on Al Jazeera. Many thanks.
Thank you.